World Fragile X Day is coming up soon on July 22nd, and in celebration, Silicon Valley Sunshine Interacts has organized a fundraiser that will donate proceeds to FRAXA, the leading research foundation in Fragile X. So for this webinar, we've got Katie Clapp, the founder of FRAXA, and she's here to talk about her experience with Fragile X and the research being done on the condition. Um, and yeah, I'll be handing it over to Katie now, but there will be information on how you can support and donate at the end of the meeting, so make sure to stick around for that.
Thank you, Ethan. Thank you, everybody who has worked to put on this fundraiser and this awareness raiser to help us meet our goal, which is to find effective treatments and ultimately a cure for Fragile X syndrome. I started FRAXA with my husband because our son Andy was diagnosed with Fragile X syndrome. And I wanted to tell you a little bit about Andy because you'll see a lot about what Fragile X syndrome does just through him. And then tell you what we have been working on and what we're excited about now as far as treatments go. So when Andy was a baby, he was so hyperactive. He exhausted us all. You can see in the picture in the top, it's not a movie because he was born, we started FRAXA in 94 and he was a couple years old then. So it's been quite some time, but he's flapping his hands there and making noises. He would exhaust everybody. There's Andy's dad and our dog, and Andy's still awake. They're still moving around. So Fragile X. What Fragile X usually appears as is intellectual disabilities, attention deficit, hyperactivity, as I just mentioned with Andy, that was true, anxiety and mood swings. It's also the most common known genetic cause of autism. And seizures do affect some people with Fragile X, including our son. The cause of Fragile X is a single gene mutation. So each gene basically functions to produce a protein. And in this case, the FMR1 gene, which is on the X chromosome, just cannot produce its protein. So people with Fragile X lack the protein FMRP, which is really important for brain function. The gene is on the X chromosome, and that's where the name Fragile X came from, because they did not know that there was actually one gene that was mutated until the very early 90s. 1991 was when they found the gene, and 1992 was when the protein was identified. So as Andy got older, he became less hyperactive, but more anxious, very sensitive, very attuned to people. And you can see in this picture on the left where he's holding our friend's little baby girl. He really wants to interact with the baby, but he's also very, very shy. And so he often would put a hand over his eyes when he thinks people are looking at him, or, when you try to take a picture. In the next picture, he's a little older and the anxiety had started, well, actually, I guess it really always was sometimes something that would turn into meltdowns. And so he got upset about something and took all the DVDs that he had and that he'd borrowed from the library, took them out of all their cases. That was just the kind of thing he would do when he got upset. So he's a challenge. Andy's sister, Laura, also was born with the Fragile X mutation, but she's unaffected. Since that gene is on the X chromosome and females have 2 copies of the X chromosome, it's kind of as if each cell in a woman's body flipped a coin and chose one X or the other, the mutated X from the mother or the other X that she got from her father. Genetics 101 here. So anyway, girls can be entirely unaffected, or they could be mildly affected, or they could be fully affected the way boys are. As Andy has gotten older, he's 35 now, he has worked through a lot of the hyperactivity. The anxiety is still a huge, huge problem, but he has found how to connect with animals, especially horses, and with his favorite people. So he really has come a long way in spite of his limitations and challenges. And so things are getting better. He is developing slowly. And we've learned that he needs a calm, friendly environment. If other people are upset, he will be upset. And horses and other animals are just wonderful for him. So I want to switch gears and tell you a little bit about FRAXA. What we're trying to do is to find a cure. And the way that we have been working really for 30 years now, because we started FRAXA shortly after Andy was diagnosed in 1994. So what FRAXA does is to fund research teams at universities around the world. And we obviously try to pick the most exciting possible projects. And out of those projects, they each get your typical FRAXA grant right now is $100,000 over 2 years to fund a postdoctoral fellow in a university lab. Out of those research grants have emerged treatment targets. And a treatment target is, as the scientists understand more about that gene that is not functioning and about the protein that's missing, the more they can find points of intervention to help either compensate for the protein or even turn that gene back on. So I'm going to spotlight a few of the projects that we funded that are really exciting right now. Once we have those targets, of course, there's more that has to be done. There's preclinical testing and then clinical trials, and then hopefully FDA-approved treatments. We are hoping to get to that point in the next year or two with the first possible treatments. We have funded over $35 million in research so far. And these are mostly universities, as I said, at 20 different countries at this point. Over 600 teams have been funded. We will never have the kind of money that is needed to cure a disease, but we can get these talented groups started, launched, until NIH could take over, the National Institutes of Health, or until they make a discovery that a pharmaceutical company is interested in. We fund 3 different approaches, I would say. Genetic treatments Well, that's as close, I use the word treatment, but that could be a cure if we're able to correct the gene so that it can produce its protein. Targeted new medications are drugs that would be developed to rectify part of the problem. And you'll see two examples next. And then we've also found that with the new technologies available now, artificial intelligence systems can basically siphon through all of the existing data on available drugs and combinations of available drugs to match them up with what's wrong in Fragile X syndrome. And so we have funded a number of AI-based efforts to identify the most promising available drugs and combinations. If I had to choose the most important of those 640 projects, FRAXA DVI is number two. Number one's coming up next or soon. FRAXA DVI is a drug validation initiative at the University of Chile. And what they do there is they have huge numbers of Fragile X mice. And whenever a potential treatment is identified, we are able to fund some testing at FRAXA DVI of that potential treatment. And to date, there have been hundreds and hundreds of potential treatments identified by FRAXA researchers that have gone down to Chile and been tested there. And the ones that really do well for the mice are then candidates for clinical trials. So we have a lot more detail on our website if you want to read about FRAXA DVI or any of these other grants that I'm mentioning. All you have to do is go to the search bar and just type in DVI and you'll see it at fraxa.org. Just in the last couple of months, two of our teams in California have made announcements, so I thought it would be fun to highlight them. So Dr. Razak at University of California in Riverside has been funded by FRAXA for a number of years. And what he has found is that one target, serotonin 1A, is a receptor in neurons. And serotonin 1A is implicated in Fragile X syndrome specifically. Now, he has a pharma startup, Neuralixis, that has developed a very, very promising serotonin 1A drug. It's an investigational drug. It has been tested at FRAXA DVI in the mice, and it's basically getting ready for potential clinical trials in Fragile X syndrome. What's interesting about this target, this receptor, is I think everybody probably knows all about Prozac and Luvox and the other SSRIs. Well, those drugs target serotonin as well, but they're blunt. They target lots of serotonin receptors, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and subtypes. As it turns out, if you just target 1A, you avoid side effects. And if the mouse studies are anything to judge from, it also in Fragile X could improve learning, cognition, and seizures. Now, all this research has actually been done by multiple labs that FRAXA funds. One in Atlanta, Mercer University, one in France, which is also associated with another startup company. So I'm highlighting Neuralixis and Dr. Razak, but this, as often happens, is a target that has been found by multiple labs, so we can be pretty sure that it's true. It has promise. This next one, this target is called the BK channel, and BK is big potassium. So this is a way that neurons communicate. And research has found mostly in Fragile X mice that there are issues with the BK channel in Fragile X. So we've had multiple labs with FRAXA funding that have found that BK channel openers are a promising new treatment possibility. And so one of the researchers we funded long ago at Scripps, Dr. Peter Vanderklish, has gotten together with others to form Spinogenics, a startup in California. And they have a new drug, a BK channel opener, that is now ready for clinical trials. And it's been awarded FDA orphan drug designation for Fragile X. So that gives a company a lot of incentives and basically speeds up the incredibly expensive and long process of developing a treatment. And because it's a rare disease, they need to help. Now, there are actually pretty exciting medications in trials right now. And these two, Zitomalast from Tetra and Zygel from Harmony, are both in large-scale phase 3 trials. And what this means is that if either of these trials succeeds, then the next step is FDA approval. They would be ready to go on the market. The Tetra trial is about halfway through enrollment. It's a big trial. It's actually 2 trials, one for teens and one for adults, but together they're looking for 300 people. Andy went through that trial. A lot of my friends have sons who've gone through that trial or are going through that trial. And there is an open label extension, which means that if you finish the double-blind trial, the individual can stay on the drug, keep taking the drug, as it is basically getting ready to go for FDA approval. The same is true for the Reconnect trial, where I don't know exactly how far through they are because the company isn't disclosing that, but it's a large trial for children and young adults with Fragile X. It is targeting mostly anxiety. And this is a gel that gets rubbed on the skin that delivers CBD at a higher dose than would be, attainable on the open market. So we're really excited about both of these. One more note on the Zitomalast is that's actually targeting learning, IQ, cognition. And in their earlier trial, they were able to show the equivalent of about a 10-point IQ increase over a 3-month trial. It was a smaller trial, 30 people, but it's extraordinary because that was adults. So these trials give me so much hope. in the meantime, we continue to do everything we can because those two medicines won't be the only drugs on the market for Fragile X. We hope they won't work for everybody. They won't work for everything. So one of the grants that we funded just this spring is to make it easier for people to participate in clinical trials by being able to have some of the trial visits done in your home. And so this team is developing a mobile EEG, electroencephalograph, which is very often used as a marker for Fragile X trials. Another new grant, we have funded a clinic in Serbia at the University of Belgrade, looking at available probiotics in children with Fragile X. And, this is not just a possible intervention that could be used now, but this also establishes an entirely new clinical trial site, which we will probably need because there is more and more interest from pharma companies and more potential treatments that are doing well down at FRAXA DVI and, could potentially be in clinical trials next. Now, the most exciting grant, this is number one. This team at University of Massachusetts made a surprise discovery when they were looking for biomarkers with a grant from FRAXA. What they discovered is that the Fragile X gene, which fails to produce a protein, is not silenced as everybody thought for 30 years. Rather, it produces an abnormal splice variant of RNA. RNA is the message that a gene produces and the message that is then used to make a protein. So in about 3/4 of the individuals that this team has analyzed who have Fragile X, there is an abnormal RNA. What they then did was to use an ASO, an oligonucleotide, antisense oligonucleotide, and I'll tell you what that is, to block the abnormal RNA. And what happened was the gene, the Fragile X gene that was silent, started to produce its normal protein. So right away, that gives you a possibility of a specific treatment. This was discovered 2 years ago. Last summer, we organized a special research meeting to get the world's experts together to present this and figure out next steps. How is this going to be tested? And then the next thing that just happened is there is now a pharma partner, a company that has signed on to this project to invest in it and create just the right ASOs to use to treat Fragile X, or at least we hope so. So what is an ASO? It's a very small strand of RNA or DNA that's basically created to match an RNA, another RNA. And so they develop one that matches the abnormal RNA that's gumming up the works and to mop it up, to block it. And that is the treatment. So Curalis, which is in Cambridge, Mass, is going to be working on this. We, FRAXA, we've doubled up on the funding for the UMass team. And we are also funding some other labs to come up with humanized mice, so mice with Fragile X human genes, cells in their brains, so that this can be tested. And organoids, which I don't have time to talk about, but another way to test a treatment like this. And one really nice thing about ASOs is ASOs are in use for other disorders. And so it's not a entirely new technology, it's a proven technology, but it has to be customized for each disease, each disorder. So we suddenly, out of the blue, had this come up. And I have to admit that when we funded that UMass team, it wasn't the top project. You know, I'm just glad we had enough money to fund them, because this is what they discovered. They are a top team. They are talented, you know, among the best researchers. They had a bit of luck. They didn't expect that result. They had ways to test, and then we are developing more ways to test, you know, FRAXA DVI and these other kinds of mouse models and the organoids. We are now working on enabling the next trials. So it's not easy to test success of a drug in Fragile X, because every individual is different and people are different from one day to the next. So how do you measure improvement? So we are working on that front. We're also working on, as you saw, finding more trial participants by establishing more clinics in different countries, in different cities, and opening up trials that can be done at home. And of course, vast funding is needed for all of this. And so we thank everybody that's helping FRAXA, and we work with these pharmaceutical companies, you know, try to basically make it easy for them to consider their discoveries and their treatments for Fragile X syndrome. So thank you very much for all your help and for listening. And I hope that, you know, this has made sense, and I would love to address any questions. Back to you, Ethan.
All right. Thank you so much, Katie. And also thank you everyone for coming and supporting FRAXA. It's just as a reminder, next week the Interact Club will be also setting up a table at the California Avenue Farmers Market in Palo Alto, and distributing FRAXA flyers and car magnets to spread awareness for Fragile X. And just like additionally, if you want to donate, there's the QR code on the flyer for the webinar, and also send a link in the chat that directly links to where you can donate.
Thank you.
Oh,
Ethan, do you want to check, see if there's any questions for Katie?
yeah. I mean, if there's any questions, yeah. So someone asked, so NIH granted $25 million in 2020 for 5 years. Do you know if there's continuation of that grant from the NIH?
Which grant is it? The NIH funded a particular grant to a team? Because they
like,
fund a lot of grants. Or you mean in total?
Yeah, I believe the question, was like, how much is for Fragile X, and then is that going to continue over the next for the years to come? I believe that was the question.
Okay. There's a competitive process at NIH, and so So each of these teams that we fund, typically, once they've gotten preliminary data from a FRAXA grant, they will then go to the NIH and try to get funding, continued funding. And there are two main types of grants. There's 5-year grants, R01s, and there's a smaller 2-year grant, kind of like a FRAXA grant. So it really depends on whether they get a good enough score. It's peer review. I've actually been on some of the peer review panels. Sometimes they like to have somebody from the patient community. So it varies. There's no way of knowing ahead of time. It's all individual grants. In general, they're not earmarked for one disease, though. Yeah. Years ago, we did a big joint funding initiative with NIH where it was earmarked for Fragile X. And we had, we contributed 200,000 and they contributed 800,000. There is another thing that the question might have been about. Maybe it's about the centers. There are 3 Fragile X centers, and they have to be renewed, I believe, every 5 years. And so I don't know. It all depends. First, Congress has to say, yep, they want to renew it. And then the researchers have to go through a competitive process. So maybe it was about that.
Yeah, I had a person who asked a question to the panel, so he or she can ask follow-up questions if there's any. Jiyoung, does this answer your question? Has Katie answered your question?
Yeah. I have a follow-up question though. So in US, we have inspired your foundation to work on the cure for Fragile X. Do you know, like, we have a communication with other part of the world to do the same thing on this?
For Fragile X?
Yes.
Yes, there is a Fragile X Foundation of Australia. They don't, I think we're the only one that funds research in a major way. But the Fragile X Foundation of Australia supports families. There is a UK alliance. Again, they support families. There's the Fragile X Foundation of Canada, which used to be called the Research Foundation of Canada, but they shifted their, their priorities